Tonight, we are gathered to hear a talk on the negotiations on defense and space arms, which is a pretty direct, straightforward statement of what you're going to talk about when you stop to think about it. But it does raise three paradoxes rather instantly. First paradox, I think the majority of Americans are for peace. God knows the majority of Americans voted for Ronald Reagan for president last November. The arms manufacturing industry also voted with their dollars. They voted millions of dollars to put the president back in the White House. That's paradox number one. Second paradox, for 40 years, we've had a Cold War. And for 40 years, we've had peace. It's a peace of mutual deterrence. So maybe the paradox is not whether we are for peace or for war, as perhaps the contractors may or may not be. The question with war and peace is, which is which? Paradox number three. For years, the Soviets have said they were going to bury us. Our own president now has a snappy comeback, or did. Moscow is the capital of the evil empire. But we pick up the morning paper and what do we find? Not only is spring springing, but there are little shy smiles in Moscow. There are little shy smiles in Washington. There is serious talk of a summit. So there's been an exchange of dead cats, back and forth, Washington to Moscow. And yet there has been a steadiness between these two monsters of East and West. So much for paradoxes. What we have actually at hand, passing before us as of this evening, may be one of the most fascinating turns in world history. It just may be that this spring, for a change, things are really coming unfrozen. There are a few new ideas in the air. One new idea is that the best defense is not necessarily an attack. The best defense is a defense. Napoleon might turn in his grave at that, but look what became of him. At the very least, we have a creative moment. Things are happening. Something is moving around. We're not frozen in space that we have been for 40 years. And it may be that the man we have been so fortunate as to attract to talk to us tonight is by experience the best informed man on earth. I ought to say here that introducing Paul Nitze is the equivalent of introducing the entire United States Marine Band. Horn by horn, string by string, drum by drum. Beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, he has served every American president. Listen to this. Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, Ford and Carter and Reagan, 9 presidents, 9 presidents. It's as if these people are afraid to walk into the Oval Office without Paul Nitze at their hand. It's not, though, that Mr. Nitze is just a good, highly political horseholder. He's not. He's a man of serious substance. Let me tell you just a very few of the kind of things that linger in his background. He's been Secretary of the Navy. He's been Deputy Secretary of Defense, representative of the Secretary of Defense to the United States delegation to the SALT talks, 1969-1974. Head of the U.S. delegation to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces negotiations with the Soviet Union. beginning this year, he's become special advisor to the President and to the Secretary of State for arms reduction negotiations. And that's not all. This is a man who does not tread only in blood and thunder. He is a trustee emeritus of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And not even is that all. He is a graduate of the Calvert School of Baltimore City. Where he got in a little trouble. And you know what the trouble was? It had to do with a pea shooter, which confirms the old adage, as the twig is bent. With great personal satisfaction and not a little curiosity, I give you Ambassador Paul Nitze.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. But your introduction does bring to mind one other episode having to do with the Calvert School. And that's, I think I was in the third or fourth grade there, and we'd been assigned the task of writing an essay of 3 pages long. And I worked on this, and I thought I had the most brilliant essay that any boy of my age had ever produced. And I turned in the essay, and the teacher of the class took in all these essays, read them overnight, and then the next morning he said there was one extraordinary essay which was submitted by the class. It was extraordinary because it contained 32 mistakes in spelling, 8 mistakes in punctuation, and the author misspelt his own name. That is literally true. So you see, I have a fond spot in my heart for Baltimore and the Calvert School. But let me deal with the subject. 3 weeks ago in Geneva, new negotiations began between the United States and the Soviet Union on nuclear and space arms. The primary work of those talks will be conducted in 3 negotiating groups, addressing strategic nuclear arms, intermediate-range nuclear arms, and defense and space arms. The subject matter and our objectives for the 2 groups on offensive nuclear arms are well known. We are pressing for equitable agreements that provide for radical reductions in strategic and intermediate-range nuclear arms. We believe such reductions will produce a more stable and reliable strategic balance. Toward this outcome, we are prepared to consider various paths and means of bridging differences between the U.S. and the Soviet positions. The Defense and Space Negotiating Group will tackle a very different set of issues that are perhaps less well understood. Of the 3 subject areas, defense and space arms are the most complex and demanding intellectually, but also the most interesting. I therefore propose to devote the bulk of my remarks today to that subject. Initially, the Defense and Space Group may be conducted somewhat differently than the other 2 fora. It may entail less of the rugs for camels bartering that will characterize negotiations in the offensive arms reduction groups, and more discussion on a theoretical plane. This is by no means bad. Such discussions can be valuable for both sides. This, in fact, will be the first time since 1972 that we have engaged in a serious discussion of the relationship between offense and defensive arms. Before examining our objectives in the Defense and Space Group, let me cover some of the background. When the SALT I talks began in 1969, both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized that there was a close relationship between strategic offensive and defensive arms. Most basically, such arms are related in the ability of a defensive system to frustrate the achievements of an offense's goals and vice versa. In the latter half of the 60s, the United States was completing major intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missile developments. We were also pursuing an active anti-ballistic missile, or ABM, program. For their part, the Soviets also had vigorous and expanding programs in both the offensive and defensive fields. With respect to ABM, however, we in the United States were coming to a conclusion that existing technology did not offer the prospect of ballistic missile defenses that were reliable and that could not be overcome at significantly less cost if the other side deployed additional defenses. As a result, we were concerned that deployment of relatively ineffective ABM systems on both sides would prompt a proliferation of offensive forces, an action-reaction cycle that would result in both sides having higher and higher levels of offensive arms. Conversely, we believe that tight limits on ABM systems might make possible reductions and comprehensive constraints on offensive missiles. We therefore were ready to negotiate stringent limits on ABM systems as an inducement to comparable constraints on offensive systems. In 1972, SALT I produced two agreements: the ABM Treaty and the Interim Agreement on Offensive Arms. Our belief that those measures would enhance the security of both sides was based on three basic assumptions. First, that constraints on ballistic missile defenses, particularly those on large phased array radars, would prevent breakout or circumvention. Second, that both sides would adhere to the agreements. And third, that severe constraints on defensives would make possible the negotiation of equally comprehensive limitations on strategic offensive arms, establishing a more stable deterrent balance at reduced levels. In fact, this third assumption was reflected in the ABM treaty text, which committed the sides to active negotiations to limit strategic arms. We thought the Soviets shared these assumptions. Unfortunately, we were wrong. Soviet actions since 1972 have eroded the basis for the first two assumptions. While the United States closed down its one permitted ABM interceptor site at Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1976, the Soviets have maintained and modernized their defense around Moscow and pursued a vigorous program that includes actions in violation of the ABM treaty. We are particularly concerned about the construction of a large phased array radar at Krasnoyarsk in central Siberia in violation of the constraints on such radars spelled out in the ABM treaty. Such actions raise serious questions about Soviet intentions with regard to possible breakout from the treaty. These actions also undermine confidence in the arms control process as a whole, raising questions about the Soviets' general willingness to comply with agreements when their military priorities are not consonant with them. Moreover, the third assumption has gone unfulfilled. We tried hard to get the Soviets to accept comprehensive limitations on offensive arms comparable to those applied to ABM systems. But the SALT I interim agreement and SALT II failed to provide meaningful constraints. They did little more than legalize existing force levels and allow for their further expansion. As a result of the failure to obtain comprehensive limits on offensive systems, strategic arsenals are much larger today than they were when SALT I was agreed. The Soviets, for example, now have 4 times as many warheads on their ballistic missiles as they did in 1972, all within the limitations of SALT. These include systems such as the SS-18, a very large, highly MIRVed ICBM that poses a particular threat to the stability of the strategic balance. The Defense and Space Negotiating Forum in Geneva offers the opportunity for a renewed discussion of the offense-defense relationship. Our principal near-term goal in that forum will be to bring about a reversal of the erosion that has occurred in the ABM treaty regime over the past 10 years. The two sides should reaffirm and reinvigorate the assumptions on which that regime was based. In particular, the Soviets should cease those activities undermining the ABM treaty and join us in negotiating and agreeing to comprehensive limits on offensive nuclear forces. Taking a longer view, we intended to discuss with the Soviets our strategic concept for the future, and in that context address the rationale and implications of President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. In short, while our immediate goals are sharp cuts in offensive nuclear arms and a return to strict adherence to the terms of the ABM treaty, we are also looking toward the possibility of a more hopeful future. This was one of the primary factors motivating the President's March 1983 decision to initiate SDI. We do not believe we should confine ourselves to a future in which deterrence rests solely on the threat of nuclear retaliation. We seek a brighter vision in which deterrence might be based more on the ability to defend rather than to avenge. New technologies hold open the prospects of defenses that will be reliable and cost-effective. When we examined the defensive systems that were available at the end of the 1960s, we concluded that ABM systems could be beaten at less cost by additional offense. The advances of the last 15 years, however, may make it possible to reverse this conclusion. Many of my scientific and technical friends are enthusiastic about the prospects of turning that possibility into reality. If these defensive technologies prove feasible, we would hope to make a transition from the current strategic relationship, which rests largely on the threat of devastating nuclear retaliation, to a deterrent posture in which defenses would make a greater contribution. We believe the latter could provide a more stable and reliable balance and a sounder basis for peace. With the right technical and political conditions, we envisage the possibility of ultimately reducing nuclear arms to zero. Deterrence would then be based on the ability of defenses to deny success to a potential aggressor's attack. This would, of course, require that we deal with other elements of the global military situation and diminish through conventional force improvements and arms control efforts such threats as that posed by the imbalance in non-nuclear arms. Were we able to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether, non-nuclear defenses would provide a critical hedge against cheating or clandestine deployments of nuclear weapon systems. Frankly, I do not believe that either side would have the necessary confidence to consider giving up nuclear arms without such a hedge. SDI thus could play a very important role in our strategic future. But let me emphasize that SDI is a research program being conducted in full compliance with the ABM Treaty. That research is intended to determine the feasibility of new defensive technologies, both Earth-based and space-based, so that a future administration can make an informed decision sometime in the next decade whether to move toward a more defense-reliant balance. In Geneva, we plan to explain why we think both the United States and the Soviet Union could be better off were we able jointly to move to a more defense-reliant relationship. New strategic defensives could so complicate a potential aggressor's planning for a possible first strike that he could not seriously contemplate it. Moreover, in the longer run, they could provide the means through which both nations could seriously consider moving to a nuclear-free world. We will also emphasize to the Soviets that the purpose of SDI is not to achieve strategic superiority. We instead envisage a cooperative endeavor by the two countries in which we would jointly manage any transition to a relationship based on a greater contribution of defenses. Indeed, the ABM Treaty requires and provides for consultations and negotiations regarding defensive systems that go beyond those permitted by its limitations. Should a transition to a more defense-reliant relationship be feasible, U.S.-Soviet cooperation would be important. We would want to coordinate the introduction of new defenses and the further reduction of offensive nuclear arms so as to ensure a continued enhancement of strategic stability. While the Soviets now protest SDI, they themselves have long engaged in research into advanced ballistic missile defense techniques. Moreover, they are realists. If it appears that reliable, survivable, and cost-effective defenses against ballistic missiles are feasible, we believe they would see the advantages in establishing agreed ground rules for phasing in defensive systems in an orderly, predictable, and stabilizing manner. This describes some of the major points we intend to make to the Soviets in Geneva. Let me turn now to some of the defense and space issues that have attracted public attention in recent months. The question has been raised regularly as to whether or not SDI is negotiable. As I noted, SDI is a research program designed to determine the feasibility of new defensive technologies. It is difficult to see how one could effectively or verifiably limit such research. The Soviets have in the past agreed with this view. How could one decide what research would lead to what specific results, and what could cross over the line into some restricted category? It would be impossible to monitor the actions and thoughts of all the scientists and technicians in the research institutes and laboratories in every country of both alliances. Moreover, SDI research holds open the one possibility of providing the means for a move to a more defense-reliant relationship one that would be more stable and reliable for both sides. To me, it makes no sense to foreclose such a possibility. Should SDI prove new defenses feasible, that is, should we begin to approach a stage where we are talking about tangible, well-defined systems, it would be a different ballgame. President Reagan has made clear that we intend to comply fully with our obligations under the ABM Treaty, and that any future decision regarding the deployment of defenses against ballistic missiles not permitted by the ABM Treaty would be a matter for negotiation. This does not imply a Soviet veto over our programs, rather our commitment to negotiations reflecting a recognition that we should move forward in a cooperative manner with the Soviets. To lay a foundation for such a cooperative approach, we are prepared even now to discuss with the Soviets the implications, as we see them, of new defensive technologies for both strategic stability and arms control. Soviet public spokesmen have frequently called for preventing the militarization of space and have urged a ban on what they call space attack weapons. In this regard, the Soviets have been vocal in their opposition to SDI, even as a research program. That is not illogical from their standpoint. In the mid-1970s, we closed down the one ABM interceptor site that we were permitted under the ABM Treaty, and dramatically scaled back our research in that area. The Soviets, on the other hand, maintained and modernized their defenses around Moscow, the world's only operational ABM system. They have devoted considerable effort and resources to research into advanced ballistic missile defense technologies. This includes high-energy lasers, for example, at the Sarishagan Test Center, and particle beam weapons. All of this effort has taken place without the kind of public debate over the long-term implications of strategic defense that has accompanied SDI. The Soviets clearly see potential applications for such technologies. It is not at all surprising that they would like to continue to be the only ones pressing forward in that field. In this vein, the Soviet propaganda line against SDI is as predictable as it is hypocritical. The Soviets hope to foster a situation in which we would unilaterally restrain our research effort, even though it is fully consistent with the ABM Treaty. This would leave them with a monopoly in the area of research into advanced ballistic missile defense technologies. From Moscow's point of view, that would certainly be the most desirable outcome. But frankly, talk about the non-militarization of space strikes me as not serious. The fact is, both sides use space for military purposes. There are numerous military satellites in orbit, the majority of them Soviet. And many of these, such as satellites for warning, communications, and verification of arms control agreements, provide vitally important services contributing to the security of both sides. Beyond these, Soviet space systems include satellites for targeting attacks against forces on Earth, and the world's only operational ASAT system. That's an anti-satellite system based at the Turya-Tam Space Launch Center. There's been some speculation about the possibilities for negotiating new limitations on systems or activities in space. We will, of course, hear out and assess with care any Soviet proposals in this regard. But my personal view is that such possibilities are, at this time, limited. I would point out that in an arms control sense, space is already heavily regulated, perhaps more so than on Earth. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits the placing of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, in space. The Limited Test Ban Treaty forbids the testing of nuclear arms in space. Additionally, all systems, whether nuclear or otherwise, which have a capability to counter strategic ballistic missiles or their warheads at any point in their trajectory, are subject to the ABM Treaty. That agreement prohibits the deployment of ABM systems in space or on Earth, except for precisely limited fixed land-based systems. Its provisions also cover testing and engineering development of such systems or their major components. As regards ballistic missile defenses, the only unregulated activity is research. As I noted earlier, it is difficult to see any way in which research could be controlled in an effective or verifiable manner. It thus appears that the sole space activity that remains to be negotiated about is that of certain anti-satellite or ASAT systems. This is a restricted class of weapons. It is restricted to non-nuclear systems capable of attacking satellites, but not capable of countering strategic ballistic missiles or strategic ballistic missile warheads. Were they capable of the latter, they would be subject to the terms of the ABM Treaty. In essence, we are talking about the Soviet Co-Orbital Interceptor, the world's only operational ASAT system, and the aircraft-launched miniature vehicle system now under development by the United States, but not tested sufficiently to be operational. I would point out that observation of testing is essential to assessing a system's capabilities. But once an ASAT weapon, such as the Soviet co-orbital ASAT, has reached operational status, monitoring its deployment is a different and far more difficult matter. Banning ASAT-capable systems presents great difficulties. Even were we to find a way to limit the declared U.S. and Soviet ASAT systems, most satellites would still be vulnerable to attack, especially by nuclear weapons. The existing Soviet Galosh ABM interceptor deployed around Moscow is capable of attacking satellites, which pose much easier targets than ballistic missile warheads. In fact, any ballistic missile capable of lofting a nuclear weapon to orbital altitudes has some inherent ASAT capability. When Secretary Shultz and Foreign Minister Gromyko met last January, they agreed on several basic objectives for the negotiations. One was preventing an arms race in space. The Soviets have since asserted that the U.S. intention to proceed with SDI contradicts this objective, that the United States is seeking an arms race in space. This is simply not true. I first would repeat that SDI is a research program being conducted in full compliance with the ABM Treaty and comparable to a Soviet effort that was underway for many years prior to SDI's inception in March 1983. But I would add that our concept, should SDI succeed, entails just the opposite of an arms race. The term arms race connotes a runaway competition between two sides, with each piling weapon upon weapon in an unbridled manner. This is certainly not what we have in mind. Instead, we envisage a transition managed jointly by the United States and the Soviet Union as a cooperative endeavor. Defenses would be introduced at a measured pace, in conjunction with progressively stricter limitations and reductions in offensive nuclear arms. The result would be that the two sides would have far fewer weapons, which would use space as a medium for delivering nuclear destruction. The cooperative approach we foresee would be designed to maintain at all times control over the mix of offensive and defensive systems on both sides, and thereby increase their confidence in the effectiveness and stability of the deterrent balance. As one can see, the issues facing the Defense and Space Group at Geneva are complex. It is also apparent that there are important differences between the U.S. approach and Soviet objectives as outlined by the Soviet spokesman. But this should not be cause for despair. Negotiation is the art of resolving differences. And Soviet rhetoric aside, I do not believe it is necessary to convince them that defense can be good. They have never considered defense per se to be bad, only U.S. defense. The Soviets will continue to protest publicly about SDI and alleged U.S. designs to spread an arms race into space. We must recognize that this propaganda is part of an overall strategy to try to manipulate public opinion in a manner that would lead to unilateral U.S. concessions. What we must do to bring them to a more serious tack is, in parallel with our efforts at the negotiating table in Geneva, to demonstrate the political will and ability to maintain the necessary military capabilities effectively to deter them. When the Soviets recognize that they will attain no exploitable military or political advantages from their military buildup, and that their propaganda campaign against SDI and other U.S. military programs will not bring about unilateral Western concessions, they may then welcome a serious discussion of how we could move jointly to a more stable strategic relationship. When they are ready for such discussion, we have ideas that could lead to a solution. We would also welcome their ideas. As Max Kampelmann, our chief negotiator and head of our negotiating group in the Defense and Space Forum, has said, "If an agreement is there, I am determined to find it." Thank you. Sure that I can't repeat all of the question. The question deals with the paradoxes that were suggested by our chairman when he introduced me. And in particular, it deals with the paradox that I've expressed these views, but there are many distinguished scientists and other commentators in this field that have expressed quite contrary views, including my former associates Gerard Smith, McGeorge Bundy, and Mr. McNamara. All of these people are, well, I haven't yet repeated all the question. I'm now trying to remember the other parts of the question. Well, I've discussed these ideas with McGeorge, Bundy, and McNamara. I had breakfast with McNamara just the other day. And I think what he was primarily concerned about was that we might go forward with systems which would not be cost effective and would stimulate an increase in the offense on the other side, and that they would be vulnerable to countermeasures. He was much impressed with my Philadelphia speech, in which I had outlined the fact that the two criteria which would govern the executive branch's consideration as to whether or not the research program had succeeded were exactly those two criteria which disturbed him most. And he was much comforted by my Philadelphia speech. And I could assure him that that speech was not just my idea. This had been, in fact, cleared with the White House, the Pentagon, everybody else in the State Department, and it did, in fact, express the executive branch policy. In fact, I might add that these two criteria, I was not the first to state those two criteria. In fact, it was Admiral Watkins, one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who first put those two criteria in writing in the annals of the Naval Proceedings magazine. But now that I think the heart of your question is this hope that it isn't proven, is this hope that one can design and build systems which will in fact be cost effective and will be not vulnerable to an attack on their major elements. Is that a realistic hope? Now, some of these people, my friend and former associate Harold Brown, takes the view that it is not practical in the sense of systems designed to intercept and boost phase. He does think it is wholly practical to develop terminal defenses, in other words, ground-based systems that operate in the atmosphere or somewhat above them. So that he believes that there is a class of such systems that can be cost-effective now and survivable. Now, there are others of my friends who feel the other way about it. They feel that it is perhaps easier to produce the space-based systems, and they can be more cost-effective. The point is that it is not clear at this time whether or not this is possible. But, I mean, whether or not it really can be done. That it is possible, I am absolutely convinced of, having dealt with many of the people working on the program.
Yes, sir.
Frankly, I think this doctrine that defenses are Maginot Lines is the most ridiculous thought about military strategy that anybody has ever expressed. You know, the real students of military strategy, you start with Clausewitz, I should think. And Clausewitz analyzes these matters at great length and comes to the conclusion that any military strategy must deal both with offense and with defense. Nobody has been able to work out a reasonable military strategy with solely on either offense or solely defense. You've got to have both. You've got to be able to defend where you're defending, and you've got to be able to attack or counterattack in order to make your defense work. So it's the interaction between offense and defense which has been traditionally at the heart of military strategy. Now, that I think is indubitable with respect to the non-nuclear age. The question really comes up as to whether it still maintains in a nuclear age because of the vast increase in the power of nuclear weapons. And so certainly for a period of years after the 1945, when they were first introduced, many thought that defense was not in the realm of the possible. But thereafter, people began to think about it, and every offense has eventually generated a defense. And that was why we got into the business of trying to produce a defense back in the 60s. But then it still couldn't meet the criterion of cost effectiveness. Today, a great deal is going on which has increased the possibilities of the defense from what it was at that time. If I look back upon the radars, for instance, which we were using in the Safeguard Sentinel system, those were immensely expensive and very big objects. Today, you can build a radar with the same capabilities, which will be a 25th the volume of the radars that were built in Kwajalein. And in those days, it cost you $100 million for a radar. Those were hand-built with devices built by Western Electric, which nobody else had ever built before. In fact, this is how IBM got into the computer business, because they borrowed it from the radars that we built for the Kwajalein defense. But today, off the shelf, you can buy a computer which has the speed and capability that those computers had. So things have changed, and it is not clear today that you can't build a defense. But I think you're right that one has to look at the interrelationship. But a final word on the Maginot Line. The problem with the Maginot Line was it didn't go far enough. To repeat the question began with the proposition that it has recently been demonstrated that Soviet strategy follows the strategic line outlined by General Ogarkov, who used to be the chief of staff of the Soviet Union. and has recently been relieved and given a different job. But that this strategy is a strategy to pursue a war-winning strategy, and that they are also bringing pressure against Western Europe and other places in the world. And shouldn't we today enter into a crash program in relationship to SDI and other similar things in order to improve our defenses against this manifest threat? In the first place, I do not believe that there's anything particularly novel about General Ogarkov's views. Is one reads Soviet military literature back ever since World War II, from 1946 on. The objective has been to win a nuclear war in the event one came about. And that is the task that has been given to the Soviet military establishment, and that is what you can see how they've tried to build toward that ever since. So there's nothing new about that I can see. There are some refinements of that general point of view in an article written by General Ogarkov, which was published in Red Flag in May. But this is, I wouldn't say that it quite supports the viewpoint that you've been outlining. The viewpoint that he takes in that article is that a nuclear war would be so destructive that the Soviet Union should avoid a nuclear war. Secondly, that the Soviet military should be given increased appropriations so that they could meet the advances that the U.S. is making in non-nuclear defenses. And thirdly, that they should concentrate upon a strategy of a series of what they would call counterattacks upon vulnerable economic, military, political salients around the world, and thus bring about a counteroffensive which would overwhelm the enemy. I think that's a quote from that article. Now but immediately after he wrote that article, he was relieved of his post. So I don't know that one can really say that represents Soviet strategy today. With respect to a crash program, frankly, even though I think the Soviets are ahead, as I've said, I think they have a monopoly at the present time upon a defensive system. We have none, and they have an ABM defense, which, however, is not that competent, so we couldn't overwhelm it. But they have the only defensive systems in the ballistic missile field. They also have the only operational ASAT system today. And I think they do have a better, what is called, counterforce capability today than we do, by far. But still, I think our defenses are such, and particularly our SLBMs and our bomber force, so that the Soviets could not think of entering into a nuclear war at this time, because it would be far too risky for them. But the object is to demonstrate to them that even with great efforts over time, they will not be able to undermine that situation. We have to have the means by which we can assure them that we will continue into the long run and as long as necessary to have an adequate deterrent. I think we have it today, but unless we act on these things now, we will be in difficulty. And better than that, we ought to be looking for a more hopeful future than just this long-term attempt to try where we have to maintain the ability to retaliate with devastating destruction. We want to get out of that if we can.
Until the end of the century, if you will.
Well, as I said earlier, I think the U.S. deterrents are now sufficiently good still that I would think the chances that the Soviets might wish to initiate a nuclear war are low. But I don't think that necessarily means that they wouldn't be capable of taking offensive action someplace else in the world where the risks are much less. And I think much of our attention must go to handling things so that those situations around the world are handled in a way that they don't get out of hand. The question is, in the light of all the various technological possibilities, isn't SDI a myth? Because it deals only with ballistic missiles and doesn't deal with cruise missiles, bombers, and other varieties of possible attack. The problem here is that when the President created the SDI program, it was given the specific task of trying to develop defenses against ballistic missiles, which are the primary threat and the threat that worries us most. And to go back to the question of the risk of war, in the real risk of there being some temptation to enter into nuclear war is through a counterforce attack which would be effective, and that would have to be an ICBM attack, I believe. The other forms take too long, etc., to be useful in a first strike. Therefore, this is the major threat. The major threat is the ballistic missile threat. That does not mean to say there aren't other threats. Certainly there are other threats. The bomber threat is another threat. The cruise missile threat is another threat. Chemical weapons and conventional weapons are also a threat if one doesn't deal with them. One has to be able to deal with all the various threats. And today, up to date, the temptation has been to kind of downplay all the others because of the supervening danger of the nuclear threat. But you've got to deal with problems one by one. And this is the problem which is the most serious one and the one to which SDI in particular is addressed. I referred to the others in my remarks. I didn't ignore the air breathers and so forth and so on. There were a lot of questions, but the last one was the specific one as to, it dealt with the fact that back when we were building the Safeguard Sentinel system in 69, 70, 71, at that time we had these big phased array radars, and we still have one, the PAR radar up in the north of North Dakota. But that those, the suggestion was that those could be defeated by chaff, and chaff are pieces of aluminum foil or something like that scattered through the air, through space that will confuse a radar. But even then, in those days, it was clear that chaff was only worthwhile above the atmosphere. The moment you get below the upper reaches of the atmosphere, why, chaff slows down. A very little bit of air will slow it down while the reentry vehicle goes faster, and therefore defenses, what are called endo-atmospheric defenses, are not defeatable by chaff. Now, but there are other ways of dealing with chaff, and so that it isn't clear that it is quite the same threat even in the outer atmosphere as it is today. But it's quite clear these are problems that need to be overcome. But there's one other point that was in the preamble to the question, and that is, as somebody said, I guess it was Dirksen said, you take $1 billion and you add another $2 billion and, you're up to real money. And here the President is talking about a research program which would be $26 billion. I know many of my European friends are very much concerned that this will represent a diversion from the other things that they are more interested in, conventional forces and so forth and so on. But I think it is worthwhile to put it into perspective. Before the President's suggestion that one has an SDI program, there were already research programs in the defense field, air defense, so forth and so on, and those amounted over a five-year period, as I recollect it, to something like $19 billion. So that this program, where the President's program is estimated to be $28 billion, you've got an increase of $9 billion over a five-year period. Now that increase is, say, $2 billion a year over 5 years. And you look at that in connection with a defense program of over $300 billion a year. It isn't that big an item. What is impressive is the rate to which inflation has taken place in the period since in '69, when we were doing the Safeguard Sentinel program. Well, at the time of Sputnik, I think very few of the people in the country were aware of the fact that it was likely that the Soviets would put an object into space ahead of the United States. Some of the people in the executive branch were perfectly clear that this was going to happen because we had cut down during that administration any research activity in the field. But today I think more people are aware of the fact that there really is a basis for concern about what the Soviets are doing in both the offensive and the defensive field. And even there's those great controversy about it, as there should be in a democracy. After all, this program that I've been talking about is an important program, does represent at least a certain shift in emphasis in what we've been doing in the strategic field, and it certainly does merit discussion. And we shouldn't go forward with a program of this kind without manifold and deep discussion all over the country, not just in Washington, but here in Baltimore and elsewhere, and not only here in this country, but also with our allies. And therefore, this is a process which I think is an entirely healthy process for there to be deep questions, and many of them, and I appreciate the opportunity of having been able to talk with this audience. Thank you.
Are we all leaving so suddenly? May I say one tiny final word to the ambassador personally. You, sir, if I may paraphrase one of your previous presidential employers, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. When I'm elected president in 1988, my first telephone call is to be to you. And I don't care how you spelled your name at Calvert School. What you have done tonight is a remarkable feat. You've picked up a complicated, slippery, elusive concept, a dramatic, even radical concept, SDI, and turned it into something clear, concise, rational, which not everybody in this room necessarily agrees with, but they know more now than they knew before. Baltimore stands a little taller and a little wiser than it did an hour ago. Thank you very much, sir.